At my son's housewarming party, surrounded by laughter and familiar faces, he walked over with a glass and smiled warmly. "Drink up, Dad. Today's the happiest day." I raised it to my lips, genuinely moved. Suddenly, my grandson lunged forward and knocked it from my hand, his face completely different from anything I had seen before. He leaned in close and said quietly, "Don't you see who just handed that to you?" That was the moment everything changed. So glad to have you with Dad's Revenge Stories. Which country or city are you watching from? Tell me below. Please note, some details are dramatized for entertainment and educational insight. Similarities to actual names or places are coincidental, but the message speaks directly to you. My son's new house smelled like fresh paint and ambition. I noticed that the moment Ryan pushed open the front door and swept his arm wide like a man introducing a stage set he had personally built from scratch. Which technically he had not. Ryan had bought the house 8 months ago from a couple relocating to Florida, and most of the renovation work had been done by a contractor whose name I could never remember. But this was Ryan's way. He had always been better at presenting things than building them. "What do you think, Dad?" he asked, watching my face the way he used to watch me unwrap Christmas presents when he was 9 years old. I stepped inside and looked around. High ceilings, new hardwood floors the color of dark honey, a kitchen island big enough to land a small aircraft. Megan had decorated it all with the kind of careful, expensive taste that looked effortless and wasn't. "It's beautiful," I said, and I meant it. What I did not say was that the house felt like it was performing for me. Every room arranged just slightly too perfectly, the way a hotel lobby is arranged, welcoming to everyone and belonging to no one. But I kept that thought to myself. Frank Calloway, 68 years old, retired pipefitter widower man who still drives a truck with 140,000 miles on it and considers that a point of pride, does not say things like that out loud at his son's housewarming party. The backyard was where most of the guests had gathered. 40, maybe 50 people spread across a flagstone patio and into the grass beyond all holding glasses that Megan's caterer kept quietly refilling. I recognized some faces. Neighbors of Ryan's I had met once before. Colleagues of Megan's whose names I had never caught. A cluster of Ryan's old college friends who all had the same haircut and the same way of laughing too loudly at things that were only mildly funny. I found a spot near the edge of the patio where the shade from the oak tree reached just far enough to be useful. My left knee had been complaining since the drive down, and standing in direct July sun was not going to improve our relationship. That was where Caleb found me. He was 20, my grandson Ryan's only child, and he had inherited his mother's dark eyes and his father's habit of arriving somewhere without making a sound. He had been working as a junior investigator at a private firm in Albany for nearly a year, an internship that had turned into something more serious, faster than anyone expected, and he had already developed the quiet, observational stillness of someone whose job required him to notice things other people missed. He materialized at my elbow with a glass of lemonade and handed it over without being asked. "How's the knee?" he said. "Opinionated," I said. "How's work?" "Busy," he said. "Always busy." He almost smiled. Caleb was not a big smiler, which had always seemed to me like a waste, because when he did smile, it rearranged his whole face into something completely different. He stood beside me and we watched the party together in the easy quiet of people who do not need to fill every moment with words. That was when Ryan appeared. He came from the direction of the drink table, moving through the crowd, with the easy, practiced confidence of a man who considered every room his room. He was holding 2 glasses, and his smile arrived about 3 steps before he did. "Dad." He said it warmly, the way a man says a word he has rehearsed being warm about. You're not hiding over here, are you? I'm enjoying the shade, I said. There's a difference. He laughed and held out one of the glasses. Dark red ice, a sprig of mint across the top. It's a sangria. Megan's been making it all afternoon. Drink up, Dad. He tilted his own glass toward me and a small toast. Today's the happiest day. I looked at my son standing there in his new backyard in front of his new house with his confident smile and his freshly pressed shirt, and something moved through my chest that I could not have named precisely. Pride, maybe. Or the particular kind of longing that comes from looking at a version of your life that went in a direction you did not expect. My wife Carol should have been standing beside me. She would have had opinions about the kitchen island. She would have had opinions about everything, and they would have all been worth hearing. I reached for the glass. Caleb's hand closed around my wrist. Not hard, not rough, but fast and certain, the way you grab someone's arm when they are about to step off a curb without looking. The sangria stopped 6 inches from my mouth. Don't drink that. His voice was low enough that only I could hear it. His jaw was set in a way I had never seen on his face before. Not the face of a concerned grandson, but the face he wore at work. The face of a man who had learned to read a room and did not like what he was reading. He stepped slightly in front of me, angling his body so that what he said next would not reach anyone else on the patio. His knuckles were white around my wrist. Caleb, I started. Don't. His voice dropped lower. Who gave you that glass, Grandpa? I looked at my son. Ryan was still smiling, but his eyes had shifted just slightly, just for a fraction of a second, toward the upper windows of the house behind us. Then back to me. Then away again, toward some guest across the yard who had called his name. And just like that, he was moving, laughing, clapping someone on the shoulder, absorbed back into the party as smoothly as a stone dropped into still water. I stood very still with my grandson's hand on my wrist and a glass of sangria suspended in the afternoon air. Around us, the party continued exactly as before. Someone was arguing about the best route to take to avoid the highway. A child was running through the sprinkler at the far edge of the grass. Megan was laughing at something near the grill, her head tilted back, her hand on someone's arm. 40 people. Sunshine. The smell of grilled food and cut grass. Nobody said anything about leaving. One moment Caleb was beside me with his hand around my wrist, and the next he was quietly collecting my jacket from the back of a patio chair and handing it to me without a word of explanation. He did not make a scene. He did not raise his voice or pull me by the arm toward the gate. He simply moved with the calm, deliberate efficiency of someone who had already decided what needed to happen and was now executing the plan. I followed him. I told Megan we were heading out, that my knee was acting up, which was true enough to count as a reason. She hugged me and said she was glad I came, and that she would send me home with leftover sangria. I told her that was very kind, and somehow managed to keep my face entirely still when she said it. Ryan was on the other side of the yard when we left. I raised my hand in his direction. He raised his back. That was our goodbye. The drive out of Ryan's neighborhood took 4 minutes. Caleb sat in the passenger seat with his hands folded in his lap, watching the houses scroll past the window. He was wearing the gray polo shirt Megan had probably told him to wear, and he had the particular rigid posture of a teenager trying very hard to appear composed and not quite succeeding. I let the silence last until we reached the county road. Then I said, "Start talking." Caleb turned toward me. Up close, I could see that his jaw was still tight, that same locked-down tension he had been carrying since the moment on the patio. He breathed out slowly through his nose, the way people do when they have been holding something in for longer than they should have. "The drink was fine," he said. "I want you to know that first. There was nothing wrong with it." All right. But Dad knew you'd take it from him. He paused. That was the point. I kept my eyes on the road. A pickup truck ahead of me was going 45 in a 55 zone, and I focused on that for a moment, because it gave my hands something to do besides tighten on the steering wheel. Explain that to me, I said. Caleb shifted in his seat to face me more directly. We covered this in training, he said. His voice had the careful, slightly formal quality of someone who had recently learned something and was now watching it happen in real life for the first time. When someone hands you a drink, you're grateful, you're relaxed, you feel like you're being taken care of. And when you're grateful and relaxed, you answer questions. You don't think too hard about them. They just feel like conversation. He paused. I recognized what Dad was doing because I'd read about it. I just never thought I'd see it at a family party. I thought about the hour before Caleb had found me by the oak tree. Ryan circling back to me twice, laughing easy, one hand on my shoulder. Do you still have trouble remembering to lock up sometimes, Dad? Getting older, right? And that thing about the pension, is it still covering everything? Okay, property taxes up here can be brutal. I had answered all of it, easily, naturally, because it had felt like my son caring about my life. He asked about the house, I said. It was not a question. He's been asking about everything for months. Caleb's voice did not waver, but something behind his eyes flickered briefly. The house, the land Grandpa left you, what you have saved, whether you still see the same doctor. He keeps a list, Grandpa. I've seen it. The pickup truck ahead of me finally turned off, and the road opened up. I did not accelerate. What else? Caleb pressed his lips together for a moment. He's been talking to people. At the party today before you got there. Uncle Dennis's neighbor, the couple from your old block who came with Aunt Patricia. He stopped. He told them you've been forgetting things. Leaving the stove on. Getting confused about what day it is. The words landed in my chest like something solid and cold. I've never left the stove on, I said. I know. I know what day it is. I know that too. Caleb's voice cracked slightly on the second word, and he pressed on immediately, not giving it room to expand. He's been doing it for a while, saying it casually like he's worried, like he's a good son who's concerned about his father. He turned to look out the windshield. By the time you got to the party, half the people there already had a version of you in their heads that wasn't real. I pulled into my driveway and sat with the engine running. The house looked the same as it always did. White siding, green shutters, the Japanese maple Carol had planted the spring before she got sick, its leaves gone deep red in the July heat. Everything exactly where it should be. How long have you known? I asked. Caleb was quiet for a moment. A real quiet, the kind that means the answer is not simple. Since February, he said finally. I heard them talking in the kitchen one night. They thought I was asleep. He looked down at his hands. I didn't know what to do. I kept thinking maybe I misunderstood. Maybe it wasn't what it sounded like. His voice dropped lower. I tried to tell you once. Back in April. I said something about Dad asking a lot of questions about the house, and you said he was just being thoughtful. I remembered that. Standing in this same driveway, Caleb helping me carry groceries inside. I had patted his shoulder and told him his father meant well. I'm sorry, I said. I should have listened. Caleb shook his head. You trusted him. That's not something to be sorry about. I turned the engine off. In the sudden quiet, I could hear the maple tree moving in the wind, its branches scraping gently against the gutter the way they always did in summer. Carol used to say it sounded like the house breathing. I looked at my grandson, this 20-year-old young man who had stood between me and something I did not yet fully understand, and I felt something tighten behind my sternum that had nothing to do with my knee. "Come inside," I said. "I'll make coffee." The coffee was too strong the way I always made it when I was not paying attention to what my hands were doing. Caleb sat across from me at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around his mug without drinking from it. The kitchen light was the warm yellow kind that Carol had always preferred over the cold white bulbs I would have chosen myself. And in that light, my grandson looked younger than 20 and older than 20 at the same time, which is a thing that happens to people when they are carrying weight that does not belong to them. We had been sitting there for 20 minutes, filling in the gaps of what he had told me in the car when the phone rang. I looked at the screen. Ryan. Caleb looked at the screen. His jaw tightened the way it had on the patio, that same locked-down clench. I was already beginning to recognize the expression I realized of a young man who had spent the past year learning to listen for what people weren't saying, and was now hearing exactly that from his own father. "You don't have to answer it," he said. "Yes, I do," I said. "He's still my son." I picked up on the third ring and put it on speaker so Caleb could hear. I'm not sure why I did that exactly. Maybe because I was tired of being the only one in the room who didn't know what was happening. "Dad." Ryan's voice came through the line, warm and controlled, the specific warmth of a man who has taken a breath before dialing. "I'm glad you picked up. Listen, I wanted to check in. You left so suddenly I was worried." "Knee was bothering me," I said. Right. Megan mentioned that." A brief pause. "Dad, I have to be honest with you. I'm a little hurt. You left without saying goodbye to half the people there, and Caleb just disappeared without telling us where he went. I didn't know if something had happened." I watched Caleb across the table. His knuckles went pale against the coffee mug. His eyes stayed fixed on the phone between us, and there was something burning behind them that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but sat right at the border between the two. "Caleb's here with me," I said. "He's fine." "Okay." Ryan exhaled. "Okay, good. Dad, did something happen tonight? Did somebody say something to upset you? Because if one of the guests..." "Nobody said anything," I said. Then what was it?" His voice shifted just slightly into something that sounded like genuine hurt. Ryan had always been talented at sounding genuinely hurt. He had been doing it since he was 4 years old, and I had refused to let him stay up past his bedtime. "I worked hard on tonight, Dad. Megan worked hard. We wanted it to be special. And you were gone before the food even came off the grill." I thought about what Caleb had told me in the car, about the questions Ryan had asked me during the party, about the people Ryan had spoken to before I arrived, the quiet and careful planting of a story about a father who was beginning to lose his grip on things. "The food looked good," I said. A pause. "Dad." Ryan. Another pause, longer this time. When Ryan spoke again, the warmth in his voice had been replaced by something that was trying to sound like patience. "I just want what's best for you. You know that. You're almost 70 years old, and you're living alone in that big house, and I worry. That's all." "Is it so wrong that I worry?" "No," I said. "Worrying about your father isn't wrong." "Then why does it feel like I'm being punished for it?" Caleb made a small sound across the table, not quite a laugh, more like the sound a person makes when they recognize something they have heard before. He pressed his hand flat against the table, fingers spread, and stared at them. "Nobody's punishing you," I said. "I want you to come live with us, Dad. I've told you that. We have the room, we have the space. Megan would love to have you. You wouldn't have to worry about the house, about the maintenance, about any of it. I could take care of all of that. His voice found its warmth again, settling into it, like a man settling into a chair he has sat in 1,000 times before. That's what sons are supposed to do. Take care of their fathers. I looked at the phone. I looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at me with those dark eyes of his, steady and clear, and gave the smallest shake of his head. We haven't discussed that, I said carefully. You've mentioned it. That's different from discussing it. Silence crackled through the line, not the comfortable kind. Dad, I think it's late, I said. And I think my coffee's getting cold. I'll call you tomorrow. I ended the call before he could answer. The kitchen went quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the window above the sink, and then it was dark again. Caleb let out a long breath that he seemed to have been holding since before I answered the phone. He picked up his coffee mug and finally drank from it, grimaced slightly at the temperature. That's exactly what he said to Mom, he said. Almost word for word. When she tried to talk him out of it back in January, he told her she was punishing him for caring. I turned my coffee mug slowly on the table. The ceramic made a small scraping sound against the wood. Caleb, I said, when you were at the house in February listening to your parents talk, what exactly did you hear? He set his mug down. He straightened in his chair. And something shifted in his expression, not the resolve of a grandson deciding to be brave, but the focus of an investigator who had finally decided the case had gone on long enough without intervention. Everything, he said. I heard everything, Grandpa. The word everything has a different weight, depending on who says it and what they have been carrying. When Caleb said it sitting across from me at my kitchen table at 10 o'clock on a July night, I felt the word land somewhere between my ribs and settle there like a stone dropped into deep water. Not a splash, just a slow, certain sinking. I refilled my coffee even though it was too late for coffee and I knew I would not sleep. I set the pot back on the burner and sat down and looked at my grandson and said, "Then tell me all of it." He did. He told me about the night in February when he had stayed late after dinner helping Megan with something in the kitchen and had stepped into the hallway to get his coat when he heard his parents' voices drop to the kind of low, deliberate register that people use when they believe they are not being heard. He stopped. In his work, you learned quickly that the conversations people had when they thought no one was listening were the only conversations worth paying attention to. He stopped. In his work, you learned quickly that the conversations people had when they thought no one was listening were the only conversations worth paying attention to. Ryan had been explaining the timeline. That was the word Caleb used, timeline, and hearing it made the back of my neck go cold. Not a vague hope, not a passing idea. A timeline. Ryan had told Megan that the property values in this part of upstate New York had increased by nearly 18% over the past 2 years. He had told her that the land my own father had left me was worth considerably more than it had been a decade ago. He had said that if things were handled correctly and handled soon, the whole situation could be arranged before the end of the year. "Nah, what situation?" I asked. Caleb looked at his hands. "You," he said quietly. He meant you, Grandpa. I sat with that for a moment. Outside, the Japanese maple scraped against the gutter in the evening wind, that same sound Carol used to call the house breathing. I had always found it comforting. Right now, it just sounded like something restless that could not get inside. He talked about the house. Caleb continued. About the land. About your retirement account. He knew the numbers, Grandpa. Not guesses. Numbers. He lifted his eyes to mine. He said your house has been paid off since 2019. He said the property taxes run about $8,400 a year. He said the land outside of town would probably list at 120 if it went to market tomorrow. Every figure was correct. I had never told Ryan any of those numbers directly, or at least I had never sat down and recited them to him like a balance sheet. But I had talked over the years the way fathers talk to sons, mentioning things in passing, complaining about the tax bill over the phone in January, saying something about the land when the subject of my father came up at Thanksgiving. Ryan had been listening to all of it, filing it away, building a picture I had no idea was being assembled. He talked about moving you into the house, Caleb said. The room they have upstairs, the one facing the backyard. He said once you were there, once it was established, once people saw it was working, it would be easier to talk about what to do with the house here. He stopped. And the land. I said, easier to talk about it with who? Caleb hesitated. Then he said, with you, and with anyone else who needed to agree. The coffee had gone cold again without my noticing. I pushed the mug to the side. He also talked about Dorothy, Caleb said. That surprised me. My neighbor Dorothy, he knows she checks on you. He mentioned her by name. Caleb's voice tightened slightly. He said he'd already talked to her, that he'd told her you'd been having some trouble lately, forgetting things, getting confused. He paused. He said she was worried about you. I felt something move through my chest that was sharp and specific. Not the general cold that had been settling in since the driveway, but something precise like a finger pressing directly on a bruise. Dorothy Haynes had lived next door to Carol and me for 15 years. She had brought us soup when Carol was in treatment. She had sat on this porch with me the night Carol died, and not said a single word, just sat there because she understood that some things do not require commentary. Ryan had gone to Dorothy and handed her a version of me that did not exist. And Dorothy, because she was a good and caring woman, had believed him. When did he talk to her? I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. March, I think. Maybe early April. Caleb looked at me carefully. I'm sorry, Grandpa. I should have told you sooner. I kept thinking, I don't know what I kept thinking. That it would stop. That Dad would change his mind. He pressed both palms flat on the table, the gesture of a man grounding himself before saying something difficult. No, I said. It didn't. I stood up and carried both mugs to the sink, and stood there with the water running over my hands for a moment, looking out the window at the dark shape of Dorothy's house next door. Her porch light was still on. It was always on after dark. She had told me once that she kept it burning so that if I ever needed anything in the night, I would know where to look. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands on the dish towel Carol had embroidered with small blue flowers the summer before she got sick. The dish towel I had washed and folded and replaced on the oven handle approximately 800 times since then, because I could not bring myself to put it away. I'm going to go see her tomorrow morning, I said. Caleb said, Dorothy, she deserves to hear the truth from me. I folded the dish towel carefully along its crease. Before it gets any harder to undo, Dorothy Haynes answered her door at 7:45 in the morning, wearing a housecoat the color of faded roses and holding a mug that said World's Okayest Golfer, which had been a gift from her late husband Gerald, and which she used every single morning without irony or explanation. She looked at me standing on her porch with no coffee and no warning and said, Frank Calloway, you look like a man who didn't sleep. I didn't, I said. She stepped back and held the door open. Then you'd better come in. Dorothy's kitchen smelled like toast and the particular brand of hand lotion she had used for as long as I had known her, something with lavender that Carol used to say was the most comforting smell in the Northern Hemisphere. The table was small and round and positioned under a window that looked out over the strip of garden between our two houses, the garden Dorothy maintained with the focused dedication of someone who understood that things needed tending, or they went wrong. She poured me coffee without asking, and sat down across from me and folded her hands around her own mug and waited. Dorothy had always been good at waiting. It was one of the things I had valued most about her in the years since Carol died, the simple and rare ability to sit with another person without filling every silence with noise. "Ryan came to see you," I said. Earlier this year, something moved across her face. Not surprise exactly, more like the expression of a person who has been wondering when a particular conversation was going to arrive. She set her mug down carefully on the table. "In March," she said. "He stopped by on a Saturday afternoon. Brought a plant." She glanced toward the windowsill where a small potted succulent sat in a terracotta pot. I had noticed it before without registering it. "He said he was in the neighborhood and wanted to introduce himself properly. We'd only met once or twice at your place over the years." "What did he tell you?" Dorothy looked at me steadily. She was 72 years old and had buried a husband and raised 3 children and taught second grade for 31 years, and there was very little that made her flinch. But something in her expression shifted to the small, careful tightening around the eyes that told me she had been sitting with this information and not entirely comfortable with it. "He said he'd been worried about you," she said. "That you'd been having some trouble forgetting things. He mentioned the stove, that you'd left a burner going a couple of times and hadn't noticed." She paused. "He said you'd gotten turned around driving home from the grocery store last month and called him because you weren't sure which street to take." The toast smell in the kitchen had turned slightly sour to me. I breathed through it. "None of that happened," I said. Dorothy's hands tightened around her mug. "Frank, Dorothy, I have never left a burner on. I know every road between here and that grocery store. I have driven that route for 30 years. I kept my voice even because she deserved evenness, not the thing that was moving around behind my sternum looking for a way out. Ryan made those things up. I don't know exactly why he told you specifically, but I can make a reasonable guess. The silence that followed was not comfortable. Dorothy stared at the succulent on the windowsill, and I watched her work through it the way an honest person works through something that troubles them, not quickly, not dismissively, but with the full weight of her attention. "Oh, he seemed so concerned," she said finally. Her voice had gone quieter. "He said you'd never admit it yourself, that you were proud, that you'd rather struggle than ask for help." She looked back at me, and there was something in her eyes that made my chest ache. Not anger at her. Nothing like that, but the particular pain of watching a good person realize they have been used. "He asked me to keep an eye on you, to call him if I noticed anything worrying." "And have you," I asked, "noticed anything worrying?" She held my gaze without blinking. "You leave your porch light on too late sometimes," she said. "And you forget to bring in your trash bins until the next morning. But Frank, I've watched you tend that yard, fix that fence, back that truck out of the driveway 100 times. Her voice steadied into something firm and clear. "You are not a man who gets lost going to the grocery store." I looked down at the coffee she had poured me. Dark roast, the way she knew I liked it, the way she had known for 15 years, without ever needing to be told again. "He built a story," I said, "before I even knew there was a story being built, so that if I ever pushed back on anything he was planning, people would already have a reason not to take my side." Dorothy's jaw tightened. She was not a woman who expressed anger loudly. She expressed it the way a retired schoolteacher expresses most things, with precision and without theatrics. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, and her grip was surprisingly strong for a woman her size. "Tell me what's happening," she said. "All of it. From the beginning." So I did. I told her about the party, about Caleb, about the phone call, about the numbers Ryan had memorized, and the timeline Caleb had overheard. I told her about the story being planted in the neighborhood like seeds growing in the dark, while I went about my life unaware. Dorothy listened without interrupting. When I finished, she sat quietly for a moment. Then she picked up her world's okayest golfer mug and took a long, deliberate sip. "Kada that boy," she said in the tone of voice she had probably used on generations of 8-year-olds who had disappointed her, "has made a very serious mistake." "What mistake is that?" I asked. She set the mug down. "He forgot that your neighbors actually know you." Dennis Calloway had been my closest friend for 41 years, which meant he had earned the right to open his front door, look at my face and say, "How bad is it?" before I had said a single word. "Bad enough," I said. He stepped aside to let us in. Dennis was 70 years old and built like a man who had spent 4 decades doing physical work and then retired and refused to stop moving. He had the kind of handshake that reminded you handshakes used to mean something, and he kept his house the way he kept his opinions, straightforward. No unnecessary decoration. Everything where it belonged. We had met on a job site in 1984 when we were both young enough to think working in the cold was something you got used to. We had been wrong about that and right about most other things. His daughter Serena was already at the kitchen table when we walked in. She was 35 with her mother's dark hair and her father's habit of cutting directly to the point without bothering with the scenic route. She had a laptop open in front of her and a legal pad beside it with notes I could not read from the doorway, and she looked at me with the careful, assessing expression of someone who has already been briefed and is now forming her own conclusions. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "Caleb told me some of what's been happening. I hope you don't mind that he reached out. He's training to be an investigator, and he figured out more than I did," I said. "I don't mind anything he does at this point." Caleb, sitting beside me, said nothing, but something in his posture loosened slightly, the way a person's shoulders drop when they have been bracing for a reaction, and the reaction turns out to be manageable. Dennis put 4 mugs on the table and filled them from a pot that had clearly been waiting for a while, the coffee dark and slightly overcooked, the way coffee gets when someone has been sitting with a problem for longer than they planned. He sat down heavily and looked at me. "I owe you an apology," he said. I looked at him. "For what, April?" "I was at your place helping you with that section of fence along the back. Ryan pulled up while we were working. Said he was dropping something off for you." Dennis wrapped both hands around his mug and stared into it. He walked the length of the garage, twice. I thought he was just looking at the property. Men do that. I didn't say anything. He raised his eyes to mine. "I should have said something, Frank. The fence." I remembered that afternoon. Ryan had stayed maybe 20 minutes, talked about nothing in particular. Left a bag of groceries on the porch that he said Megan had put together. I had been touched by it at the time. "You didn't know," I said. "I had a feeling." Dennis set his mug down with a firmness that meant the subject was closed. "That's not the same as not knowing, and we both know it." Serena turned her laptop toward me. "Mr. Calloway, I want to show you something. Caleb gave me Ryan's name, and I spent some time yesterday evening looking at his public social media. I want you to understand that everything I'm about to show you is publicly visible to anyone who isn't on his restricted list." The screen showed Ryan's Facebook page. Serena scrolled slowly, and I leaned forward in my chair. The posts went back 4 months. The first one was a photograph of Ryan and Megan standing in the doorway of what I recognized as the upstairs room in their new house. the room with the window facing the backyard. Ryan had his arm around Megan's shoulders, and they were both smiling, and the caption read, "Getting the guest room ready for someone very special. Can't wait to have you closer, Dad." The post had 63 likes and 14 comments. I recognized several of the names. Cousins. Old family friends. A woman from the church Carol and I had attended for 20 years, who had written, "This is so beautiful, Ryan. Your father is lucky to have a son like you." I straightened up in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "He restricted you from seeing these," Serena said carefully. "People on his restricted list can't see posts unless Ryan specifically makes them public. He controls who sees what." "So the whole family has been watching this," I said. "For months," Serena confirmed. "He posted 7 times between March and last week. Photos of the room being set up. A post about researching the best arrangements for aging parents." She paused. "One post that specifically mentioned concerns about seniors living alone." Dennis made a sound that was not quite a word. Serena continued, "The important thing to understand is that he created a public record of his version of events before your version existed. If you push back now, there are 60-70 people in your extended family and social circle who have already been watching this story develop for 4 months." She kept her voice steady and professional, but her eyes were direct. "He didn't just plan this inside his house. He built an audience for it," Caleb said quietly. "I tried to tell you in April, Grandpa. He'd already started posting by then." I looked at the screen again, at Ryan's smile in the doorway of that room, at the caption, at the 63 people who had pressed a small thumbs-up button and moved on with their day, not knowing they were watching the opening act of something else entirely. "Can you scroll down?" I asked Serena. She did. 3 posts later, there was a photograph of the room again, furnished now a lamp on the nightstand curtains drawn back from the window. On the dresser, visible in the corner of the frame, sat a small wooden box I recognized immediately. My chest tightened around something that had no name. That box had been on the shelf in my bedroom for 19 years. Carol had kept her mother's jewelry in it. I had assumed it was still there exactly where it had always been, because I had stopped looking at it directly the way you stop looking directly at things that hurt. I had not looked at that shelf in weeks. Caleb had a key to his parents' house. He had kept it since moving out, the kind of arrangement families make when everyone still assumes goodwill, and which nobody had thought to revisit. That was the only reason we could walk through Ryan's front door on a Tuesday afternoon without knocking, without announcing ourselves, without giving anyone the opportunity to rearrange what was inside before we got there. Caleb moved through the house with the careful quiet of someone who had been taught to observe a space before announcing himself in it, a habit he had picked up in his first months on the job and had not been able to turn off since. Caleb led the way up the stairs without hesitation, and I followed him, and the house around us was quiet in the specific way that houses are quiet when the people who live in them are somewhere else entirely. The door to the upstairs room was closed. Caleb stopped in front of it and looked at me. He did not reach for the handle immediately. There was something in his posture that reminded me of the moment before you pull off a bandage, the brief necessary pause where you acknowledge that what comes next is going to hurt. "You ready?" he said. "Open it," I said. He opened it. The room was exactly as it had appeared in the Facebook photograph, and also nothing like it, because photographs flatten things into 2 dimensions and strip them of the quality that makes spaces feel inhabited or violated or both at the same time. The curtains were drawn back from the window the way Megan liked curtains, folded precisely at the sides. There was a lamp on the nightstand with a warm bulb already screwed in. The dresser had been dusted recently. Someone had put a small vase of dried flowers on the windowsill, the kind of detail that is meant to make a room feel welcoming, and instead made the back of my throat tighten. I stepped inside. The wooden box was on the dresser, exactly where the photograph had shown it. Dark walnut brass hinges a small dent on the left corner from the time Carol had knocked it off the shelf, reaching for something above it, and we had both pretended not to notice the dent from that day forward, because that was how we handled small domestic accidents, with a mutual and comfortable amnesia. I picked it up. It was lighter than I remembered, or maybe my hands were less steady than usual, and I could not tell which. I set it back down and made myself look at the rest of the room. On the shelf above the dresser, arranged with a care that made my stomach turn, were 3 framed photographs I recognized from my own bedroom at home. Carol and me at Dennis and Barbara's 4th of July party, 1989, the summer before Ryan was born. Carol holding a newborn Ryan in the hospital, her face exhausted and radiant in equal measure. The 3 of us at the Grand Canyon, Ryan maybe 10 years old, squinting into the sun with his hand raised against the glare. I had not noticed those frames were missing from my bedroom. I had not noticed because they had always been there, and you stop seeing things that have always been there, which is exactly what Ryan had counted on. "Grandpa," Caleb's voice came from behind me, careful and low. "There's more." He was standing at the closet which he had opened while I was looking at the photographs. On the shelf inside, stacked in a way that suggested they had been placed there deliberately over multiple visits rather than moved all at once, were things I recognized. The green ceramic mixing bowl Carol had used every Thanksgiving for as long as I could remember. The one with the small chip on the rim that she had always said gave it character. A coffee can I used to keep hardware and screws and nails sorted by size the way my own father had taught me. A navy blue cardigan I had been looking for since February and assumed I had left somewhere. My jaw tightened until I could feel it in my back teeth. "He didn't move all of this at once," I said. My voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. "No," Caleb said. He closed the closet door quietly, like he was trying not to disturb something. "Mom would come over to help out. She'd say she was cleaning or dropping off groceries. Dad would keep you busy outside or in the kitchen." He stopped. I didn't know what she was taking. I thought she was just being helpful. I thought about Megan in my kitchen, washing dishes she had not dirtied, opening cabinets to put things away that did not need putting away. I had been grateful. I had told Carol about it once in the way I sometimes talked to Carol, still standing in the backyard in the early mornings, when the light came through the maple at a certain angle. I had said Megan's been good to me. I think she's genuinely good. I still thought Megan was capable of being genuinely good. That was the part that made it worse. I turned around and looked at the nightstand. There was a book on it, a paperback thriller Carol had been reading the last summer she was well enough to read for pleasure. Her bookmark was still in it, a folded receipt from the hardware store dated 4 years ago. I had not known where that book was. I had not looked for it, because looking for it meant confronting the fact that the person who had been reading it was gone, and I had decided without making a conscious decision to let it stay lost. Ryan had found it. Ryan had put it here in this room on this nightstand, positioned with the spine facing out, so you could read the title from the doorway. My hand was trembling when I picked it up, a fine and persistent tremor that started somewhere in my forearm and worked its way down to my fingers, and I held the book against my chest and stood in the middle of my son's prepared room and breathed. Caleb stepped forward and put his hand on my arm. He did not say anything. He did not try to explain or comfort or reduce what I was feeling into something smaller and more manageable. He just put his hand there and kept it there, 20 years old and steadier than the floor beneath my feet. After a moment, I said, "Help me carry these to the car." He nodded. We started with the photographs. I did not open the notebook that night. I carried it inside with everything else, set it on the kitchen table, while I found places for the photographs and the ceramic bowl and the cardigan that smelled faintly of cedar from wherever Ryan had been keeping it. And then I stood in the kitchen looking at the notebook and decided I was not ready. Some things require a particular kind of stillness before you can approach them, and I had not found that stillness yet. I made dinner instead. Scrambled eggs and toast, the meal of a man who is feeding himself out of obligation rather than hunger. And I ate it standing at the counter because sitting down at the table meant sitting across from the notebook, and I was not ready for that either. Caleb had gone home. He had helped me carry everything to the truck, helped me carry it back in, and then stood in my kitchen doorway for a moment, with his hands in his pockets, looking at me the way people look at someone they are not sure whether to leave alone. "I'll be fine," I told him. He nodded slowly, the way young people nod when they do not entirely believe you but have decided to respect the claim. After he left the house, felt the way houses feel at night, when you are the only person in them and you have recently been reminded of exactly how alone that is. I washed my plate. I dried it. I put it back in the cabinet above the sink, the cabinet Carol had reorganized twice in 30 years, because she could never quite decide whether the plates should be next to the glasses or across from them, and I had never moved anything after she died, because I could not remember which arrangement had been her final decision. I sat down at the kitchen table at 11:15, with the notebook in front of me, and a mug of chamomile tea I had made, because coffee at 11 o'clock would have been a surrender to the fact that I was not going to sleep regardless. Carol's handwriting on the cover was small and slanted slightly to the right, the way it always had been, the same handwriting that had signed birthday cards and grocery lists, and the occasional note left on the counter that said something like, "Gone to Dorothy's back by 3, there is soup in the refrigerator, and I made it the way you like it without the celery." I opened the notebook to the first page. She had dated the entries. The earliest was from 4 years ago, which meant she had started it about 8 months after her diagnosis. I had not known she kept a notebook. Or perhaps I had known in the vague way you know things that are happening in a house you share with someone, sensed the fact of it without examining it, the way you sense the weather changing without looking directly at the sky. I read slowly. Her observations about the garden, about a book she had been reading, about a conversation we had at dinner one night, where I had said something that made her laugh until she had to put down her fork. She had written it down, the exact words, because she said my sense of humor was one of the things she had loved about me first, and she wanted a record of it. My chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with my heart, and everything to do with it. I turned pages carefully, the way you handle things that cannot be replaced. She wrote about Ryan twice in the earlier entries. Warm observations, a mother noting her son's accomplishments, a birthday dinner he had arranged, a phone call where he had made her laugh. Then there was a gap of several months where the entries were shorter, more tired, the handwriting slightly less precise in the way that told me she had been writing on the difficult days when sitting up required effort. Then I reached the page with the folded corner. I stopped with my fingers on the fold for a long moment. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street, its headlights briefly crossing the ceiling, and then it was dark again and quiet again, and there was only Carol's notebook and whatever she had decided to say on this page that she had marked deliberately that she had folded herself. I opened it. Her handwriting here was slow and careful, more deliberate than the rest. The handwriting of someone choosing every word before committing it to the page. She had written, "Frank, I need to tell you something about Ryan because I am not sure I will have another chance to say it, where you will actually hear it." I kept reading. She wrote that she had watched Ryan over the years with the particular vision that mothers develop, the vision that sees through the performance to the intention underneath. She wrote that she loved him, that loving him did not require pretending she did not see what she saw. She wrote that Ryan had always understood the value of things more readily than the value of people, and that she had hoped he would grow out of it and was no longer certain that he would. She wrote, "You have always been too generous with people who understand exactly how generous you are. That is one of the finest things about you, and it is the thing I worry about most." And then she wrote, "If Ryan ever tells you he wants to take care of you, Frank, ask yourself who is being taken care of." I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that, with the notebook open in front of me and my chamomile tea gone completely cold. The maple tree moved against the gutter outside, that sound Carol had called the house breathing. I had always found it comforting. Tonight it felt like she was still here, breathing alongside me, having said the things she needed to say. My phone buzzed on the table, a text message from a number I did not recognize. I picked it up and read it, and the warmth that had briefly settled in my chest went cold and specific. The message said, "Mr. Calloway, this is Riverside Auto. We have the deposit on your 2019 Ford F-150. When would you like to come in and complete the paperwork?" I called Riverside Auto at 8 o'clock the next morning, because I had been awake since 5, and there was no point pretending otherwise. The phone rang twice before a man picked up with the cheerful efficiency of someone who had been at his desk since 7:30 and considered that a reasonable way to spend a morning. He identified himself as Craig, said he was with the sales coordination team, and asked how he could help me. I told him my name. I told him I had received a text message the previous evening regarding a deposit on a Ford F-150 registered in my name. "Oh yes, absolutely, Mr. Calloway." The sound of keyboard typing, brief and confident. "We've been expecting your call. Your son reached out to us about 6 weeks ago. He said you were looking to sell and that you'd be in touch to coordinate the paperwork. We have a buyer lined up, deposit's been received, they're very motivated. If you wanted to come in this week, we could have everything wrapped up by Friday." I sat at the kitchen table with Carol's notebook still in front of me from the night before and looked at the window above the sink where the morning light was coming through in long, pale strips across the floor. "How much deposit?" I asked. $500. The agreed sale price was $8,200 for the vehicle. A brief pause. "Is everything all right, Mr. Calloway? Your son mentioned you'd been a little scattered lately, so if you need me to walk you through—" "I'm not scattered," I said. My voice came out flat and quiet, the voice I used when I needed to keep something contained that would otherwise not stay contained. "Craig, I need you to listen to me carefully. That truck is titled in my name. I did not authorize my son to list it for sale. I did not agree to any sale price. I did not consent to any of this transaction." A silence on the other end, longer than the previous ones. "Mr. Calloway," Craig said carefully, his cheerful efficiency replaced by something more cautious. "I have to be honest with you, this puts us in a difficult position. We have a signed listing agreement. Signed by who?" Another pause. More keyboard sounds. "It appears to be signed by your son as your representative. Did anyone ask him for documentation proving he had the authority to act as my representative?" The silence that followed had a particular quality. The silence of a man realizing that a transaction he had processed in good faith may have had a significant problem at its foundation. "I would need to pull the original paperwork," Craig said slowly. "But typically, in a private party listing situation, you don't require proof that the person selling a vehicle actually owns it or has the right to sell it. In most cases, the seller is—" He stopped, started again. "Mr. Calloway, I think we need to get our manager involved in this conversation." I told him that would be fine. I told him I was not angry with him personally, which was true, and that I would appreciate it if they could return the buyer's deposit promptly and remove the listing, which he agreed to do. I also asked him to note in their records that no transaction involving that vehicle should be processed without my direct and documented authorization. He said he would make sure of it. His voice had lost all of its morning cheerfulness by the time we ended the call. I sat for a moment after I hung up. The truck was in the garage exactly where it had always been. I could hear it the way you hear things that are yours, when you suddenly understand they were in danger of becoming someone else's present, in a way they had not been 5 minutes ago, weighted with a significance they did not previously carry. I had driven that truck for 6 years. I had driven Carol to her treatments, in it, her hand on the center console between us. Neither of us talking much on those drives, because we had both understood that talking too much was a way of using up something that should be saved. Ryan had put a price on it. $8,200. He had taken photographs listed it collected $500 from a stranger and told the dealership that his father had been a little scattered lately, so please be patient. I picked up my phone and called Dennis. He answered on the second ring with a gruff, "Yeah." "Ryan listed my truck for sale," I said. "6 weeks ago. There's a deposit on it. I just got off the phone with the dealership." The sound Dennis made was not a word. It was the sound a man makes when he has been keeping his anger carefully managed, and something tips it past the point of management. Then he pulled it back because Dennis had spent 40 years around heavy machinery and understood that uncontrolled things caused damage. "Is it handled?" he asked. "Listings being pulled, deposits going back to the buyer." I stood up from the table and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the garage. "He told them I'd been scattered." That was the word he used. "He's been using that word everywhere, Dennis. Dorothy, the dealership. He's been building a version of me that needs managing." "I know." Dennis's voice was low and steady. "Frank, I've been thinking since yesterday. There's more you need to see." Serena found something else when she was going through his public posts. She didn't want to show you everything at once. A pause. "She thinks you're ready now." I looked at the garage door. Behind it, $8,200 worth of a life I had built, and a man who thought he could put a number on it and call that love. "When?" I said. "Come over this afternoon." Another pause, briefer. "And Frank, how are you holding up?" I thought about Carol's notebook on the kitchen table, about the folded page, about the line she had written in her careful, slanted hand. "Ask yourself who is being taken care of." "I'm angry," I said, "but I'm clear." Dennis said, "Good. Clear is what we need right now." Caleb called me on a Thursday evening in early August and said, "Dad has a work dinner. He won't be back until 9. Mom's alone. I think if you came over, she'd talk to you." I asked him if Megan knew he was making this call. He said no, but I know my mother. She's been wanting to say something for weeks. She just needs someone to open the door. I drove over at 7 o'clock. The summer light was still long and golden the way it gets in upstate New York in August. The kind of evening that makes the world look more forgiving than it actually is. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment looking at the house. Ryan's house. The house with the upstairs room that I had walked through 3 weeks earlier, carrying out pieces of my life that had been moved there without my knowledge or consent. Megan answered the door before I knocked. She had heard the truck. She was wearing jeans and a gray sweatshirt, with the collar stretched out, the kind of clothing people wear when they are not expecting company, and have stopped caring that they are not expecting company. Her eyes went to me, then to the driveway behind me, checking instinctively for a second car that was not there. "Ryan's not home," I said. "I know." She stepped back from the door. "Come in, Frank." We sat in the kitchen, which seemed to be where all the important conversations in my life were happening lately. Megan put the kettle on without asking, and kept her back to me for a moment longer than necessary, the way people do when they are deciding how much of themselves they are willing to put on the table. When she turned around, her jaw was set, and her eyes were red at the edges in the way that suggested she had been crying earlier and had stopped and was determined not to start again. She sat down across from me and folded her hands on the table and said, "Caleb called you." "He did." She nodded slowly. "He's a good kid." Her voice caught slightly on the last word, and she pressed her lips together and pushed through it. "He's better than both of us, honestly. Ryan and me. He got something from somewhere that neither of us gave him." I thought about Caleb at the bottom of the stairs in February, hearing things he should not have had to hear, carrying them alone for 5 months, before the afternoon on the patio, when he finally put himself between me and something I did not see coming. I thought Megan was probably right. "Tell me what you know," I said. She looked at her hands. "Ryan started talking about it last January, after the holidays. He had been reading about property values, about what houses in this area were selling for." She paused. "He kept saying it made no sense for you to be alone in a 3-bedroom house when you didn't need all that space. That it was inefficient. That was the word he used. Inefficient." The kettle began to build toward its whistle. Neither of us moved. "I told him it was your house," Megan said. "That you hadn't asked for his opinion about how you were using it. He said I didn't understand long-term financial planning." A short breath through her nose. "Ryan says that whenever I disagree with him, that I don't understand something. It's very effective. After a while, you start to believe it." "Did he tell you what he was planning to do?" She met my eyes. "Not all at once. It came in pieces. The Facebook posts, he said those were just to keep family updated, to show people he was being a good son. The conversations with your neighbors, he said he was just checking in, making sure people were looking out for you." She stopped. "The room." She looked away. "He said he was getting it ready because he was sure you'd come around. That once you saw how comfortable it could be, you'd understand it was the right thing." The kettle hit its whistle and she got up and poured water over 2 tea bags and brought the mugs back to the table and sat down and wrapped both hands around hers and stared into it. "Megan," I said carefully, "did you know he was taking things from my house?" Her jaw tightened. A muscle worked beneath her cheekbone. "I knew I was bringing some of your things over. He said you'd want them with you when you moved in. That it would make the room feel more like yours." She raised her eyes to mine, and they were wet now, despite her earlier determination. I told myself it was thoughtful. I needed to believe it was thoughtful, Frank. "Do you understand what I mean by that, Tim?" I did. I understood exactly what she meant. I had spent 19 years watching Ryan's mother do the same thing in reverse, insisting on seeing the best in people she loved, even when the evidence pointed elsewhere. Carol had eventually stopped doing it, which was how that folded page in the notebook had come to exist. "He told me it was the right thing for the family," Megan said. Her voice had dropped to something quieter and more unsteady. "He said after everything he'd done, after all the years of waiting, it was just the right time." That was the phrase he kept using. She stopped. After all the years of waiting. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the last of the August light was going gold and flat across the yard. "Megan," I said, "what was he waiting for?" She looked at me with wet eyes and a jaw that was still trying to stay firm, and said something that I knew she had been sitting with for months, something that had been making her feel sick every time it surfaced in her mind. "For you to need him," she said. "He was waiting for you to need him so badly that you wouldn't ask too many questions about what came next." The mug in my hands had gone warm and then cool without my noticing. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. I heard a car slow on the street outside and then continue past, and we both watched the window until we were sure it had not turned into the driveway. The car on the street continued past without slowing, and we both let out a breath we had not coordinated and had not needed to. Megan stood up and went to the window and looked out at the driveway for a moment before coming back to the table. She did not sit down immediately. She stood with one hand resting on the back of her chair, and I could see her making a decision the way you can see weather moving across an open field before it arrives. The gathering of something that has been building for a long time. She sat down. She pulled her mug toward her, and then pushed it away again without drinking from it. "Stella, there are two more things," she said. "I need to tell you because Caleb will tell you eventually, and I would rather you hear it from me." I waited. "Ryan promised Brandon and Lisa they could rent your house." She said it the way you say something that has been sitting in your chest, like a splinter, fast and direct, wanting it out. His brother-in-law and his wife. He told them back in May that once you moved in with us, your house would be available. He gave them a number, below market rate, in exchange for them helping cover some of the renovation costs on this house. I had met Brandon and Lisa 3 times over the years, at Thanksgiving dinners and a graduation party. They were pleasant people who had never given me any reason to think poorly of them. The idea that they had been sitting with this information since May, making plans around a house I still lived in, still woke up in every morning, produced a feeling in my stomach that was not quite nausea but was close enough to it that I set my own mug down carefully. "He told them this in May," I said. "Yes." "While I was living there?" "Yes." Megan's voice had gone very quiet. "I told him it was wrong. I told him he was counting chickens, that you hadn't agreed to anything. He said you would come around. He said it was just a matter of timing and approach." She looked at the table. "He had an answer for everything I said. He always does." I thought about Brandon and Lisa sitting in their own kitchen somewhere, talking about paint colors and furniture arrangements for a house that belonged to me. Planning a life in the space where I had raised a son and buried a wife and learned the particular geography of being alone after a long time of not being alone. "What's the second thing?" I asked. Megan reached across to the counter behind her without getting up and pulled open a kitchen drawer and took out a folded piece of paper and set it on the table between us. She kept her fingers on it for a moment before sliding it toward me. I unfolded it. It was 2 pages printed, the font slightly too large, the way documents look when someone has formatted them to appear more official than they are. At the top it said Family Care and Residential Authorization in bold letters, and below that in smaller text, a paragraph I read twice to make sure I understood it correctly. The document stated that I, Frank Calloway, in recognition of my advancing years and in the interest of ensuring consistent care and decision-making, was designating my son, Ryan Calloway, as my authorized representative for all matters relating to my residents' daily care and living arrangements, in the event that I demonstrated any difficulty managing these matters independently. My signature was at the bottom of the second page. I recognized it because it was mine. I did not remember signing this document. "He had you sign it in March," Megan said. Her voice was steady but thin, the steadiness of something stretched close to its limit. "He brought over a folder of papers. He said it was a supplemental health insurance enrollment form, that your coverage had a gap, and this would fill it. You signed the whole packet without reading it. He had me witness it." She pressed her lips together. "I witnessed it, Frank. I signed my name on the witness line. I looked at the document in my hands, at my own signature, at Megan's name below it in her careful, small handwriting. "Is this legal?" I asked. I kept my voice even because losing my evenness right now would not serve either of us. Serena says no. Megan folded her hands on the table. I called her 2 weeks ago when I finally admitted to myself that I couldn't keep pretending this was just Ryan being overzealous. She explained that in New York State, a legitimate power of attorney has to be notarized and witnessed according to a specific statutory form. This document isn't any of those things. It has no legal force. She paused. But Ryan doesn't intend to use it in court. He intends to use it with people who don't know the difference. Doctors, neighbors, family members who see a signed piece of paper and assume it means what it looks like it means. I set the document on the table and smoothed it flat with my palm, the way you flatten something you want to look at directly without flinching. My name, my signature. Obtained while I was sitting in this kitchen thinking my son had come over to help me with an insurance gap. He sat across from me, I said. He handed me a pen. Megan's eyes filled. She did not look away. I know. And you witnessed it. I know. Her voice broke on the second word, a clean and specific break, and she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. I have been trying to figure out how to live with that ever since. I don't have an answer yet. We sat with that for a moment, the weight of it distributed between us in the way that certain things have to be shared, because one person cannot hold all of it alone. Then headlights swept across the kitchen wall. A car slowing, turning. The sound of tires on the driveway. Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway from the hall, his face tight. "Dad's home," he said. "Early." I stood up and picked up the document from the table and folded it and put it in my jacket pocket. Megan watched me do it and did not say a word, and in that silence she gave me something that could not be taken back. Ryan came through the front door with his jacket over one arm and his phone in his other hand, and the particular distracted energy of a man whose evening had not gone the way he planned. He stopped when he saw me standing in his kitchen. The 3 seconds that followed were the most honest 3 seconds Ryan and I had shared in longer than I could calculate, because there was no performance ready, no warm smile retrieved from wherever he kept it, no easy explanation assembled and waiting. There was just my son's face showing me something unguarded and immediate, and what I saw there was not guilt exactly. Not the hot flush of someone caught doing something they know is wrong. It was something colder than that. It was calculation. Even surprised Ryan was already calculating. "Dad." He recovered quickly the way he always had. "I didn't know you were coming over." "I was in the neighborhood," I said. His eyes moved to Megan, who was standing at the kitchen counter with her arms folded and her face arranged into something careful and neutral that I suspected had cost her considerable effort. Then his eyes moved to Caleb in the doorway. Then back to me. "Well." He set his jacket over the back of a chair and dropped his phone on the counter. Can I get you something?" "Have you eaten?" "I was just leaving," I said. I picked up my own jacket from the chair where I had draped it and walked toward the front door. Ryan stepped slightly to the side, not blocking my way. Not exactly, but present enough that I had to move around him, and as I did, he said, "Dad, we should talk. Properly. I feel like there's been a lot of misunderstanding lately." I stopped with my hand on the doorframe and looked at my son standing in his kitchen in front of his wife who had just spent 40 minutes telling me the truth about him. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been maintaining something heavy for a long time and was beginning to feel the weight of it in his shoulders. "We will," I said. "Soon." I left before he could answer. In the truck, I sat for a moment, with both hands on the wheel and the engine running and the darkness of August pressing against the windows. Then I backed out of the driveway and drove home, and the whole way I kept thinking about Megan's face when Ryan walked in. Not afraid, not guilty. Something more complicated than either of those things. The face of a woman who had made a series of choices she could not unmake, and was only now beginning to understand the full dimension of what those choices had cost. I did not sleep well. I had not slept well in 3 weeks, which was becoming its own kind of education. Pastor Glenn Abrams opened the door of the church at 7:15 the following morning and found me sitting on the front steps with 2 cups of coffee from the gas station on Route 9. Because the church did not open until 8, and I had not wanted to wait. He was 65 years old, lean and deliberate in his movements, with the kind of face that had absorbed a great deal of other people's difficulty over the years, and had become through that absorption something steady and unhurried. He had known Carol and me since we started coming to services 14 years ago, not regularly, not with the consistency of the deeply faithful, but often enough that he knew which pew we preferred, and that Carol always cried at the same point in the same hymn, and that I was the kind of man who needed to be sitting down before he could talk about anything important. He looked at the 2 coffee cups and sat down beside me on the steps without being asked. "Ryan came to see me," he said, before I had said a single word, before I had even handed him his coffee. I looked at him. "Some March," he said. "A Tuesday afternoon." He sat in my office for 40 minutes. Pastor Glenn accepted the coffee I held out and wrapped both hands around it. He said he was worried about you, that you were getting to an age where living alone wasn't wise, that you were too proud to ask for help, that what you needed was someone you trusted to guide you toward making a better decision. He paused. He asked me to talk to you, to use whatever influence I had to help you see that moving in with him was the right thing. The morning was cool for August, the kind of cool that arrives in upstate New York in the early hours as a preview of what September will feel like, the air carrying a faint smell of wet grass and distant rain. I held my coffee with both hands the way Pastor Glenn was holding his. "What did you tell him?" I asked. I told him I would think about it. He took a sip of his coffee and looked out at the parking lot, empty at this hour except for his own car and my truck. "And then I thought about it, and I thought about you, and I thought about the difference between a son who wants his father to have support and a son who wants his father to make a particular decision." He turned to look at me directly. "Those are very different things, Frank. The first one asks what you need. The second one already has the answer and is looking for someone to help deliver it." I looked at the parking lot. A sparrow was working at something on the asphalt near the far edge, persistent and entirely focused the way small birds are. "He told you I was too proud to ask for help," I said. "He did. Did that sound like me to you?" Pastor Glenn considered this with the genuine seriousness he brought to most things. "It sounded like a description of you that was accurate enough to be plausible and incomplete enough to be useful to the person describing you." He took another sip. "Carol used to say you had the biggest heart and the worst radar in town." A brief, warm pause. She was right about both. The sparrow found whatever it had been looking for and flew away. The parking lot was very still. "He's been building this for a long time," I said. "I know." Pastor Glenn looked at his coffee cup. "I should have called you in March. I told myself I needed more information. The truth is, I did not want to be the person who told a man his son might not have his best interests at heart." He looked at me steadily. "That was a failure of courage on my part, and I am sorry for it. I thought about all the people who had known pieces of this and said nothing. Dorothy, Dennis, Pastor Glenn. Each of them with a reason that made sense from the inside. Each of them with something they had preferred not to look at directly. I was beginning to understand that Ryan had not just planned around me. he had planned around all of us. Serena had the folder open on Dennis's kitchen table when I arrived that afternoon. It was a plain manila folder, the kind you buy in bulk at any office supply store, unremarkable in every way, except for what was written on the tab in Ryan's handwriting. I recognized the handwriting before I read the words, the same neat, slightly forward-leaning print that had appeared on birthday cards and Christmas tags, and the occasional note left in my mailbox over the years. The tab said, "Dad Transition Plan." I pulled out the chair across from Serena and sat down. Dennis stood at the counter with his arms folded the way Dennis stood when he was keeping himself deliberately still. Caleb was at the end of the table, his hands flat on the surface in front of him, watching my face. "Caleb found this 3 days ago," Serena said. She kept her voice professional and level, the voice of someone who understood that information this size needed to be delivered without additional weight added to it. He was looking for a phone charger in his father's desk drawer. The folder was in the back. I looked at Caleb. He met my eyes and gave a small, tight nod. "You don't have to apologize," I told him. "I know," he said. But his jaw was rigid, and his shoulders were carrying something that looked like it had been there for 3 days and was not getting lighter. Serena turned the folder toward me. Inside were 4 pages printed and organized with the methodical care of someone who had been thinking about this for a long time and had finally decided to put it on paper. The first page was a list. I read it slowly. At the top it said in Ryan's neat print, "Current Assets, F. Callaway." Below that, organized into 3 sections, were the details of everything I owned. The house on Birchwood Lane was listed with its address, its square footage, its lot size, the year it was built, and 2 figures side by side, the assessed tax value, which Ryan had pulled from the Albany County property tax records, and the estimated market value, which he had arrived at by averaging 3 recent comparable sales in the neighborhood. The assessed value was $290,000. The estimated market value was $340,000. Ryan had circled the higher number. Below the house, the parcel of land my father had left me outside of town, listed with its acreage, its tax parcel number, and a note that said, "Estimated current value $120,000, up from $62 in 2018 per county assessment records. Potential for residential development, verify zoning." He had underlined "verify zoning" below the land, my retirement account. He did not have the exact figure which told me he had been estimating, but his estimate was close enough to the truth that it made the muscles in my forearms tighten. He had written estimated IRA balance 90 to 100,000 based on pension statements, visible in study filing cabinet. "Visible in his study filing cabinet," I said. "He would have seen them during the times Megan was helping out at the house." Serena said carefully, "The filing cabinet in your study, is it locked?" It was not locked. It had never been locked because I had never needed it to be locked. I kept tax returns and insurance documents, and the deed to the house in it, organized the way my father had taught me to organize important papers in labeled folders that any person who opened the drawer could read without difficulty. "The property tax records," I said. "He got those himself." "In New York State, property tax assessments are public record," Serena said. "Anyone can look up any property's assessed value, tax history, and ownership information through the county assessor's database. It's available online. He didn't need your help to get those numbers." She paused. "He only needed your help to get the ones you kept in that filing cabinet." I turned to the second page. This one was headed Timeline Preferred Outcome, and below that heading, Ryan had laid out a sequence of events in numbered order. Number 1 was Dad agrees to trial period at our house target before Thanksgiving. Number 2, house listed for rental, Brandon and Lisa confirmed as tenants, January. Number 3, Evaluate longer-term options for property, including potential sale spring. Evaluate longer-term options, including potential sale. I was still alive. I was 68 years old in reasonable health with a functioning mind and no intention of going anywhere. And my son had written a document that described the potential sale of my house as a longer-term option to be evaluated in the spring, the way you discuss renovating a kitchen or replacing a roof. A project. A line item with a target date. "There's a fourth page," Dennis said from the counter. His voice was controlled in the careful way Dennis controlled things when he was angry. "Show him the fourth page, Serena." Serena turned to it. At the top it said notes. Below that, in Ryan's handwriting, were observations. "Dad responds well to framing around Carol's wishes. Use this. Glenn Abrams, possible ally, approach carefully. Dorothy Haynes, check in, keep her thinking he needs supervision. Caleb, do not discuss with C, he won't understand the bigger picture." I sat with that last line for a long moment. Do not discuss with C, he won't understand the bigger picture. Caleb at the end of the table had gone very still. His face was the face of a 20-year-old young man reading in his father's handwriting that his father had considered him a variable to be managed rather than a person to be trusted, and who understood with the particular clarity of someone trained to read people that this was exactly the kind of note a person wrote when they were afraid of being seen clearly by someone who knew how to look. I watched something move across his expression that was not quite hurt and not quite anger, but contained elements of both the specific pain of a son discovering the precise dimensions of a father's regard. "Uncle." "Caleb," I said. He looked at me. His eyes were dry, but the effort of keeping them dry was visible. "You understood the bigger picture better than anyone in this family," I said. "I need you to know that." He pressed his lips together and nodded once, and the nod cost him something, and I did not look away from him while it did, because he had not looked away from me in the parking lot at the housewarming party when I needed someone to stay present, and the least I could do was return the courtesy. Serena closed the folder. The kitchen was quiet, except for the sound of Dennis setting his coffee mug down on the counter, with a firmness that expressed without words everything he had decided not to say out loud. "What do you want to do, Frank?" Serena asked. I looked at the folder with my name on the tab. Dad Transition Plan. Written in my son's handwriting, the same hand that had once printed in large and careful letters a Father's Day card that said, "You are the best dad in the whole world," and which I had kept in the top drawer of that same filing cabinet for 30 years. "I want to talk to him," I said. "Face to face, all of it on the table." I looked at Dennis. "I want you there. And Glenn." I looked at Serena. "Can you be there too?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Good," I said. "Then we'll do it Sunday." I had a standing appointment with Dr. Patricia Morrison on the third Thursday of every month. This had been true for 6 years, since Carol's illness had made both of us more attentive to the business of staying healthy. And it remained true after Carol was gone because the appointments had become a kind of structure in my weeks, a fixed point in the calendar that required nothing of me except showing up and answering questions honestly. Dr. Morrison was 53, precise and unhurried, with the manner of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that most of what she told people they already knew and simply needed permission to act on. She had been Carol's doctor, too. She had sat with me in this same office on a Tuesday afternoon 4 years ago and explained what the scan results meant. And I had appreciated then that she did not reach for softening language when the truth was hard enough already. I sat in the chair across from her desk on the third Thursday of August, and she looked at her computer screen for a moment longer than usual before she looked at me. "Frank," she said, "before we get into the regular check-in, I need to ask you something. Did you call us in April to update your emergency contact information? I looked at her. No, I said. She turned the monitor slightly so I could see the screen. Someone called the practice on April 14th. They identified themselves as you. They asked to update the emergency contact on your file from Dennis Calloway to Ryan Calloway. She paused. They also provided a new primary address for your records. The address they gave is not your address on Birchwood Lane. I leaned forward and looked at the address on the screen. It was Ryan's address. I sat back in my chair and looked at the window behind Dr. Morrison's desk, which faced a small courtyard with a wooden bench and a garden that the practice maintained with more ambition than success. The garden had been struggling with the August heat. Several of the plants looked as though they had been making an effort and had recently stopped. That wasn't me, I said. Dr. Morrison nodded. Her expression was careful and professional, and also beneath those things concerned in the way that good doctors are concerned when something does not fit the expected pattern. I suspected as much, she said. The receptionist who took the call noted that the caller seemed to be speaking from a list. That's her word, a list. He had your date of birth, your insurance information, your patient ID number. Everything you would need to be convincing. But not my voice, I said. She's only spoken to you in person. Phone verification isn't something we typically require for administrative updates. She folded her hands on the desk. Frank, I want to be clear with you. Under HIPAA, your medical information belongs to you. Your emergency contact, your address, your records. No one has the right to change those without your explicit consent. What happened here was a violation of that, regardless of who made that call or why. She paused. I've already asked our office manager to restore your original information and flag the account so that any future changes require you to appear in person with identification. Thank you, I said. Do you want to tell me what's happening? I told her. Not everything, not the full accumulation of the past 6 weeks, but enough. The housewarming party, the folder, the document I had signed in March, thinking it was insurance paperwork. Dr. Morrison listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I valued most about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at her folded hands. The emergency contact change concerns me most, she said finally. Not because of what it is, but because of what it's designed to do. She looked up at me. If you had come in here with a health emergency, if you had been brought in unconscious or disoriented, the first person we would have contacted was Ryan. He would have been the one making decisions, directing care, deciding what information to share with other family members. She held my gaze steadily. That's a significant amount of authority to have over another person's life, Frank. And it was arranged without your knowledge. I had understood this intellectually since Caleb had first mentioned the emergency contact change weeks ago. But sitting in Dr. Morrison's office, hearing her describe it in the flat clinical language of medical practice, first person we would have contacted, making decisions, directing care, it acquired a weight it had not previously carried. Not because the words were alarming, because they were ordinary. This was simply how it worked. You listed a name, and that name became the voice that spoke for you when you could not speak for yourself. Ryan had put his name there and not told me, and if nothing had surfaced, if Caleb had not been awake at the bottom of the stairs in February, if I had not walked into that room with the curtains drawn back and the lamp already screwed in, the name would still be there, waiting. I drove home from Dr. Morrison's office and sat in my truck in my own driveway for several minutes before going inside. The Japanese maple had turned slightly in the August heat, its leaves curling at the edges, not yet the red of October, but moving toward it, the way things move toward what they are going to become, whether you are watching or not. I went inside and picked up my phone and called Ryan. He answered on the second ring. "Dad." "Hey." His voice had the careful warmth it always had when he was not certain what was coming. "Sunday," I said. "Come to the house, 10 in the morning." A brief pause. "Sure. Is everything okay?" "I'd like to sit down and talk," I said. "There are some things I want to go over with you." Another pause, slightly longer. "Of course. Do you want Megan to come?" I thought about Megan at her kitchen table with her hands folded and her eyes wet, and the folder she had pulled from the drawer and slid toward me across the table. I thought about her name on the witness line. "That's up to her," I said. Ryan said he would be there. He said it the way he said most things, with a smoothness that gave nothing away. After I hung up, I stood in my kitchen with the phone in my hand and looked at Carol's notebook still on the table where I had left it the morning I read the folded page. And I thought about what she had written in her careful, slanted hand. "Ask yourself who is being taken care of." I finally knew the answer. And on Sunday, Ryan was going to know that I knew. You are listening to Dad's Revenge Stories. Before I reveal the shocking confrontation that exposes my son's true colors at the kitchen table, drop a 100 in the comments below, so I know you're still here with me. Please note the upcoming events contain fictionalized elements crafted for dramatic and cautionary insight. If that is not what you are looking for today, feel free to stop the video right here. I was up at 5:30 on Sunday morning, which was not unusual for me anymore. I made coffee and scrambled eggs and ate standing at the counter the way I had been eating most of my meals lately, looking out the window at the backyard, where the Japanese maple was beginning to show the first serious hints of red at the tips of its branches, the annual transformation that Carol had always tracked with the particular attention she gave to things she loved. She used to say that tree turned earlier than any other maple on the block because it was showing off. I had never disagreed with her. Dennis arrived at 9:15, which was earlier than I had asked him to come, and exactly when I had expected him. He let himself in through the back door the way he had been doing for 30 years, and set a box of pastries on the counter without comment, because Dennis expressed care through the provision of food and did not require acknowledgement for it. Pastor Glenn arrived at 9:45 on foot, having walked the 6 blocks from the church, the way he walked everywhere in good weather. A habit he maintained on the grounds that a man who spent his professional life asking others to reflect on themselves had a responsibility to do the same, and walking was where he did his best reflecting. He accepted a cup of coffee and a cheese Danish and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the folder I had placed in the center of it, and said nothing because Pastor Glenn also understood the value of not filling space with words before the right moment arrived. At 10 o'clock, exactly, Ryan's car turned into the driveway. I watched from the kitchen window as he sat in it for a moment before getting out. He was wearing a collared shirt, which told me he had thought about this, had decided the occasion called for a particular presentation of himself. He carried nothing in his hands. He came to the front door and knocked, which he had not done in years, which told me the sight of Dennis's truck in the driveway had already changed his calculations about what kind of morning this was going to be. I opened the door. "Dad." He looked past me into the hallway, then back at my face. "Dennis is here." "Come in," I said. He came in. He walked into the kitchen and saw Dennis at the counter and Pastor Glenn at the table and the manila folder in the center of the table, and I watched him process all 3 of these things in sequence and reassemble his expression into something cooperative and open, the expression of a man who has decided that the best strategy for an uncertain situation is to appear as though he has nothing to hide. "See, Pastor Glenn." He shook the pastor's hand with both of his, the grip of a man who had learned early that physical warmth could substitute for other kinds. Good to see you, Ryan. Pastor Glenn's voice was pleasant and gave nothing away. Ryan sat down at the table across from the folder. He did not look at it directly. He looked at me as I took the chair beside Dennis, and his expression was attentive and slightly concerned, the expression he had been using with me for months. "Is this about the house?" he asked. He said it with a small, rueful, almost smile, the smile of a man acknowledging a difficult conversation that he is prepared to handle maturely. "Because I know I've pushed too hard. Megan's been telling me that. I hear you, Dad. I just worry." "I know you do," I said. "You're almost 70. That's not an insult, it's just a fact. And I've been handling it wrong, I concede that now." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. "I come on too strong sometimes. Carol used to tell me that too. I get an idea in my head and I push when I should listen. I'm working on it." He was very good. He had always been very good. The acknowledgement of the flaw, preemptive, specific enough to seem genuine, positioned to make any further challenge look like piling on after a man had already admitted his mistake. I had watched him use this approach in arguments with Megan, with colleagues, with anyone who came at him with a complaint he had time to prepare for. I let him finish. Then I pushed the folder across the table toward him. He looked at it, at his own handwriting on the tab. "Dad, transition plan." Something happened behind his eyes. Not panic. Reassessment. He looked at the folder the way a chess player looks at a board when a piece appears in a position he had not anticipated, calculating quickly and quietly what the new configuration meant. "Where did you get this?" he asked. His voice was still even. "Does it matter?" I said. He opened the folder. He turned to the first page. The list. He looked at it for a moment, and then he did something I had not expected. He closed the folder and sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly. And when he looked back at me, his expression had shifted into something that was not the cooperative openness from before, but was not yet what lay beneath it either. It was the expression of a man deciding how much further he needed to go. "I was trying to plan ahead," he said. "That's all this is. Being responsible. Thinking about the future." "Is that something I have to apologize for?" Dennis said from the counter. "You measured his garage in April, Ryan." The sentence landed in the kitchen with the quiet, definitive weight of something that had been sitting in a pocket for a long time and was finally being set on the table. Ryan turned to look at Dennis. Dennis looked back at him with the steady, unimpressed attention of a 70-year-old man who had spent his life in the company of heavy equipment and had learned to recognize exactly how much pressure a structure could bear before it failed. "I was thinking about whether the space could work," Ryan said. "It's his garage," Dennis said. It's not a space. It belongs to your father." Ryan turned back to me. His jaw had tightened slightly. The cooperative expression was still there, but it was working harder now, the way a coat looks when it is buttoned against wind. "Dad," he said, "can we talk about this without an audience?" I looked at my son across the kitchen table in the house I had lived in for 31 years, surrounded by people who had chosen each in their own time and way to show up. "No," I said. "We can't." Ryan's cooperative expression did not dissolve gradually. It came apart the way ice does when the temperature has been building against it for too long. Not slowly, not gracefully, but all at once in a single moment where the structure simply stopped holding. He pushed back from the table and stood up. "You want the truth?" His voice had dropped the warmth entirely, the way you drop something heavy when your hands finally give out. "Fine. Here it is." He looked at me across the table with the eyes of a man who had been maintaining a performance for so long that stopping it felt like relief. You're 68 years old, Dad. You live alone in a house worth $340,000, sitting on land worth another 120. You have money in accounts you never touch in a filing cabinet. You don't lock in a life you're just maintaining out of habit. His voice was rising now, tight and controlled and rising. I have waited my entire life. I have been patient. I have shown up, I have called, I have done everything a son is supposed to do. And you sit in that house like it's a museum and act like nothing is supposed to change. He put both hands flat on the table and leaned forward. I am your only son. What exactly do you think happens to all of it? Who do you think it belongs to? The kitchen was absolutely still. Dennis had gone rigid at the counter. Pastor Glenn had set his coffee cup down without a sound. I looked at my son, at the face I had known for 42 years, at the anger there, genuine and unguarded, and underneath the anger, something worse, the absolute certainty of a man who had convinced himself that what he wanted and what he deserved were the same thing. Ryan, I said quietly, it belongs to me. I'm still here. Ryan left without finishing his coffee. He picked up his jacket from the chair where he had draped it and walked out through the front door with the careful, rigid posture of a man who understood that whatever he said next would cost him something he was not prepared to pay. The door did not slam. That was almost worse. A slammed door would have meant something uncalculated. The quiet click of it closing behind him meant he was still even now managing his presentation. Dennis exhaled slowly. Pastor Glenn picked up his coffee cup again. Nobody said anything for a moment, and that moment had the particular quality of air after a storm has passed through, not peaceful exactly, but still. I looked at the folder on the table. Dad transition plan in my son's handwriting, sitting in my kitchen, in my house, on a Sunday morning in late August. I had spent 6 weeks finding out what was inside that folder, and now I had sat across from the man who made it and said the only thing there was left to say, and he had walked out through my front door without finishing his coffee. I had spent 6 weeks finding out what was inside that folder, and now I had sat across from the man who made it and said the only thing there was left to say, and he had walked out through my front door without finishing his coffee. I did not know what I had expected to feel. Relief, maybe, or the particular exhaustion that follows the long effort. What I actually felt was something quieter than either of those things, something that was not quite sadness and not quite peace, but lived in the territory between them, in the place where you go after you have finally stopped waiting for something to be different than it is. Dennis cleared his throat. You all right? Yes, I said, and meant it more than I had meant it in months. Pastor Glenn set his cup down and looked at me with the steady, unhurried attention he brought to most things. He'll need time, he said. That doesn't mean he'll use it well, but he'll need it. I know, I said. Dennis made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement, and contained his full opinion of Ryan's prospects for personal growth, without requiring him to say anything uncharitable in a man of God's kitchen. I appreciated the restraint. We sat for another 20 minutes. Dennis finished his Danish. Pastor Glenn accepted a second cup of coffee that he drank slowly, looking out the kitchen window at the backyard where the Japanese maple was just beginning to show the first faint hints of color at the tips of its branches. The three of us talked about small things the way people talk after something large has concluded, finding their way back to the ordinary texture of conversation through subjects that required nothing of anyone. When they left, the house was very quiet. I stood in the kitchen for a while, after the sound of Dennis's truck had faded down the street, looking at the table where 4 people had sat that morning, with a manila folder between them and a 42-year history that had finally said what it needed to say out loud. I picked up the folder and put it in the drawer beside the stove, not because I needed it anymore, but because I was not ready to throw it away. And sometimes the honest thing to do is acknowledge that you are not ready. I called Caleb that afternoon. He picked up on the first ring, which told me he had been waiting, which told me he had understood this morning was happening, even though I had not told him so directly. That was Caleb. At 20 years old, he was still learning the work, still finding his footing in a profession that required you to see things other people missed. But somewhere along the way, he had turned that same careful attention toward his own family, and it had cost him something. It would probably cost him things in the years ahead, too. People who see clearly tend to see what others would prefer remain unseen. I told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting, the way he always listened, with the complete and focused attention of someone who understood that listening was its own form of respect. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you okay, Grandpa?" The simplicity of it, 4 words from a 20-year-old young man who had carried more than his share of this from the beginning, who had stood between me and something I did not see coming at a party in July, and had not stopped standing there since. The question landed in my chest with a weight that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with the particular kind of gratitude that you feel toward someone who asks the right thing at the right moment. "I'm better than I've been in a long time," I said. He breathed out slowly, controlled the way they had been teaching him to manage reactions on the job. But underneath the control there was relief, and I could hear it. "Good," he said. "That's good, Grandpa." "Good," he said. "That's good, Grandpa." We talked for a few more minutes about nothing in particular, the way you talk. After something important has been settled, finding your way back to the surface through ordinary conversation. Before he hung up, he said he would come by in a couple of days. I told him there was no rush. He said he knew that and was coming anyway. 2 days later, he pulled into my driveway at 10 in the morning in the second-hand Honda he had bought when he started the job in Albany, and we went together to Ryan's house. Megan answered the door. She looked at us for a moment without speaking her expression, holding several things at once in the way her expressions often did now. And then she stepped back and let us in without requiring an explanation. Ryan was not there. I did not ask where he was. The upstairs room was exactly as we had left it 3 weeks earlier, when Caleb and I had carried out the photographs and the box and the cardigan and Carol's paperback. The room had not been repurposed. The furniture was still arranged the same way, the lamp still on the nightstand, the curtains still folded back from the window. It looked like what it was, a room that had been prepared for a purpose that had not come to pass. We carried out the last few things that remained. A small carved wooden duck that had been my father's, which I had not noticed, was missing until I saw it on the windowsill. 2 coffee mugs from a trip Carol and I had taken to Vermont the summer Ryan was 12 souvenir mugs with a covered bridge on them that she had insisted on buying and that I had teased her about for years and had kept on the shelf in the kitchen for 19 years since. Megan stood in the doorway of the room while we worked. She did not help and did not hinder. When we were done and the room was empty of everything that had come from my house, she looked at me and said, "I'm sorry, Frank." Her voice was steady and quiet, and meant it the apology of a person who understood it did not fix anything, and was offering it anyway because it was the true thing. "I know," I said. We drove back to Birchwood Lane with the truck bed carrying the last pieces of what had been taken. Caleb carried everything inside while I unlocked the door and held it open, and then we went through the house together, putting each thing back where it belonged. The wooden duck on the shelf in the study beside the window where the light hit it in the afternoons. The Vermont mugs in the cabinet above the sink handles facing out the way Carol had always insisted, because she said a mug with its handle facing the wall was a mug that did not want to be used. Last I went upstairs to the bedroom and stood in the doorway and looked at the shelf above the dresser. The photographs in their correct positions. The wooden box in its correct corner. The paperback on the nightstand with the receipt bookmark still holding Carol's place. The place where she had stopped reading and had not come back to the page that had been waiting for 4 years. Something settled in my chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. Not the dramatic resolution of a thing that has been broken and is now repaired. More like the quiet click of a door closing properly, the sound of something returning to where it was always supposed to be. This was my house. These were my things. I was 68 years old, and I was not going anywhere. The maple was full red by the first Sunday in October. I had been watching it turn for 3 weeks. The way Carol used to watch it, tracking the color from the tip of each branch inward, the way you follow good news as it travels. She had a name for the exact shade it reached in the second week of October, somewhere between burgundy and fire, and the name she used was perfect, and I could not remember it now, which was the particular grief of losing someone who gave precise names to beautiful things. But I watched the tree the way she had taught me to watch it, and that morning I thought it had reached the color she meant. I started cooking at noon, not the half-hearted cooking I had been doing for months. Scrambled eggs, eaten standing at the counter, soup warmed from a can, because the alternative required caring about the outcome. This was the other kind. Pot roast in the Dutch oven Carol had used so long the handles had darkened where hands gripped them. Cornbread from the recipe she had written on an index card in 1987, and which I had kept in the kitchen drawer through 3 house cleanings and 1 flood. The green bean dish she had made every fall since the first year we were married, with the crispy onions on top that I had always eaten first off the serving dish when her back was turned, and which she had always pretended not to notice, and which I made extra of now because there was no one left to pretend. Dorothy arrived at 1:30 carrying a pie in both hands and wearing her good cardigan, the blue one she saved for occasions she considered worth dressing for. She handed me the pie with the information that she had made it from scratch, which was true, and which she mentioned only once, which for Dorothy represented considerable restraint. She walked into my kitchen and looked around at the pot on the stove and the cornbread in the pan and the green beans already in their dish and said, "Frank Calloway, you cooked an actual meal." In the tone of a woman who had been eating microwaved soup next door and was now experiencing complicated feelings about that choice. "Sit down," I told her. "There's coffee." Dennis arrived at 2 with Serena beside him and a 6-pack of beer under his arm that he set in the refrigerator without asking, because he had been setting things in my refrigerator without asking for 40 years and saw no reason to begin requesting permission now. Serena brought flowers, yellow and white, and found the vase in the cabinet above the sink, without being told where it was, which meant she had been paying attention to this kitchen in a way that made me feel for the first time that she was not just a resource I had called on in a difficult month, but someone who might be around afterward. Pastor Glenn came last on foot, empty-handed, and stood in my doorway with his coat over his arm and said, "I brought myself." Dennis from the kitchen called out that it was barely enough. Glenn laughed from somewhere deep in his chest, and Dorothy said something sharp and fond from the table. And that was how the afternoon began, not with a formal announcement or a moment of acknowledged significance, but with an old joke between people who had earned the right to make it. We ate at the kitchen table because the dining room was where I put things I did not know where else to put, and the kitchen table was where life actually happened in this house. All 5 of us crowded around it, the way the table had never quite been designed, for 5 elbows. Close dishes passed hand to hand, Dorothy cutting the pot roast, before anyone asked her to, because she had decided that was her role, and she was correct. We talked about nothing consequential. Dorothy's garden, which had recovered from the August heat better than expected. A movie Dennis had seen that he could not recommend but could not stop describing. A family of deer Serena had spotted on her drive up from the city, 3 of them standing in a field in the early morning fog, looking at her car with the calm, complete indifference of animals who have not yet learned to be afraid of anything. Nobody mentioned Ryan. He had occupied enough space in this family for enough months, and the afternoon did not belong to him. It belonged to pot roast and cornbread, and a pie Dorothy had made from scratch, and the particular quality of October light coming through my kitchen window at 4 o'clock, going gold and long across the table the way light does in autumn when it understands it is running out of time and decides to be beautiful about it. After dinner, while Dennis and Pastor Glenn argued pleasantly about something at the table and Dorothy organized the leftover situation with the focused authority of a woman who considers other people's refrigerators her jurisdiction, Serena and I stood at the sink washing dishes the way people wash dishes when they are not in a hurry and do not need to fill the quiet with explanation. "How are you doing?" she asked. Not the version of the question people ask when they want a short answer. The version that means I have time and I am actually asking. "Better," I said. "Genuinely better." Caleb came in from the backyard, where he had been sitting on the porch steps in the October cold, for reasons he had not explained, and that I had not asked about, because 20-year-olds who spend their days reading other people's behavior sometimes need silence when they are with the people they actually love, and I had learned by now that Caleb was one of them. He came into the kitchen with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the table and then at me. And then he went to the cabinet above the sink and took down a glass and filled it with water from the tap and carried it over and held it out. I looked at the glass, then at him. "Is this safe?" I asked. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Almost. The almost was enough. "It's just water, Grandpa." That's not what I asked. He understood. He sat down in the chair beside me and set the glass on the table between us and said, "I know who gave it to you. You can drink it." I picked up the glass. I drank from it slowly, the way you drink something when you are aware of the drinking, when the act itself has become more than the thing it usually is. The water was cold and plain and tasted like nothing except water, which was exactly what it was and exactly what I needed it to be. Outside the window, the Japanese maple held its red against the October sky with the particular confidence of a tree that has been through this before and knows how it ends and intends to be magnificent about it anyway. Carol had planted it the spring before she got sick. She had chosen it specifically for the fall. Color had researched varieties and driven 40 minutes to a nursery in the next county to find the right one because Carol did not do things by accident, and she understood that the things you plant in spring are the things that keep you company in October. I thought, this is enough. I thought this is exactly enough. I have told you this family story, not because I am proud of how long it took me to see what was in front of me, but because I think most of us are slow to see the things we most need to see. I trusted my son because I loved him. That was not a mistake. The mistake was confusing love with blindness. If there is one thing I have learned from all of this, it is what Carol wrote on that folded page. Ask yourself who is being taken care of. I believe God puts people in our lives who tell us the truth when we cannot find it ourselves. For me, that person was my 20-year-old grandson, still learning his trade, still finding his place in the world, but clear-eyed enough to see what the adults around him had missed, and brave enough to do something about it. These grandpa stories are not comfortable. Neither is life. If someone in your family is making decisions about your future without asking you, that is not love. That is control wearing love's clothing. Do not wait as long as I did to tell the difference. This family story belongs to anyone who has ever felt invisible inside their own life. You are not invisible. You are still here. If these grandpa stories stayed with you, leave a comment below. Share this with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the end. The following stories contain fictional elements crafted for reflection and understanding. If that is not what you are looking for today, we respect that completely. Another story may serve you better.